Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Thank you. Order. We now come to the emergency debate on the EU referendum and alleged breaches of electoral law. This debate, as colleagues will know, as I informed the House yesterday, can run for up to 2 hours. Mr. Tom Brake.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and can I thank you in particular for helping facilitate this debate, which, as you said yesterday, was in order for an SO24 emergency debate. And the debate, as members will know, that the motion is that this House has considered the EU referendum and alleged breaches of electoral law. I'd like to start, Mr. Speaker, by just reminding colleagues of what the Prime Minister said yesterday about Brexit. They want us to get on with it, and that is what we are going to do, column 525 of yesterday's Hansard. And she also dismissed any concerns about vote leave activities in answer to a question from the honourable member for Airdrie and Shotts, who is not in his place but was here yesterday. And she is hiding behind what I think is an increasingly tatty and threadbare comfort blanket, and that is the will of the people. Her sole justification for the disastrous act of self-harm she is imposing on the country. She has not in this place been able to deploy any sound economic, diplomatic, cultural or security reasons why Brexit is good for the country, but she has frequently referred to the will of the people. I'm very happy to give way to a friendly intervention.
So grateful, because the debate's about the electoral law, not about all the other tattiness which we approach. Might I just put on the record, as somebody who wanted to leave, that the law is the law and nobody is above it. And if the law has been broken, or if there are grounds to suspect that, the full weight of that law should be thrown at those organisations where that has occurred.
I thank him for what I wasn't entirely anticipating a friendly intervention, but indeed that was a very friendly intervention. Let me just make a little bit more progress and then I will give way. So, the Prime Minister does not appear willing to entertain any prospect that the allegations that are before us are true, and that therefore the will of the people was in fact usurped, and that in fact the people were cheated. And it was my concern about whether in fact the law was broken that led me to refer the matter to the Electoral Commission and the police. I'm happy to give way to John.
I thank the honourable gentleman for giving way. Does he think, in a way, and I don't think he is going to suggest for 1 minute, that that's an effect on the outcome of the referendum? Would he agree with me that it didn't have an effect on the outcome, or does he think differently?
Well, I thank him for that intervention. I think he's encouraging me to speculate on a matter which it is very difficult to respond to. I mean, if the allegations, and they are allegations and they're not proven, but if the allegations are true, and that a potentially £625,000 was spent illegally in a very focused, targeted campaign, which by definition would have been focused and targeted on a very small number of people, then I think it's very hard to predict the effect that would have had. So, and I suppose that is partly what I hope any inquiries will lead and may clarify. I'm happy to give way a further time.
I'm very grateful to the right honourable gentleman for giving way. Would he not acknowledge, though, that the Remain campaign spent about a third more on the EU referendum, and indeed the government spent over £9 million of taxpayers' money sending a leaflet to every house in the UK promoting that we Remain, and that could be seen as bias in favour of that campaign?
I thank him for that intervention, but what we have in front of us, and many members on this side will have seen, and possibly some on the other side, is a very comprehensive dossier of allegations about the way in which Vote Leave and Be Leave broke the law, allegedly. Now, if he wants to bring to this House, or if he wants to present to the Electoral Commission and the police a similar dossier in relation to the allegations that he may or may not have heard about Stronger In, then of course he should do that. And I think on both sides of the House we would welcome that. But the fact is that the only thing we have in front of us is that dossier that the Electoral Commission and the police are now considering in relation to vote leave and B leaves activities. So I don't think he should try and muddy the waters in the way that I'm afraid he's seeking to do. Now, I want to focus, before I do, I'm happy to give way.
I'm grateful for my honourable friend giving way. Many of us in this House were around during the Iraq war debates when we were given a dossier. Many of us were not convinced, having read that dossier in detail. Others were, and this House voted to take us to a war which proved not, with the facts but based on that decision by this House, proved not to be the case. This dossier is far more convincing than the previous dossier. Does he not therefore agree with me that it should be investigated and taken seriously by everybody in this House?
Yes, and I'm sorry that there's been laughter from the other side of the chamber. I think members of Parliament, whether in fact they supported Remain or Leave, should, I would have thought, be interested in finding out whether the law has been broken, and it's not should not be a subject of hilarity in the way that it seems to be for some members on the other side of the House. And I hope it's not going to be a hilarious intervention.
It's deadly serious, actually. But could the honourable gentleman tell me the size of the fine the Liberal Democrat Party received by the Electoral Commission for breach of election law during the referendum?
I'm very happy to say that it was, I understand, £18,000. I think the slight difference is that, as a party, we would perhaps love to be able to spend close to the spending limit in relation to election law, but as a party we're never able to. Yeah, the allegation here is that a combination of the vote leave and B leave spending actually broke the law. So I think the gentleman should wipe the smile off his face and focus on whether in fact the law has been broken and treat that more seriously than he appears to be doing at the moment. So I'm happy to give way.
I'm grateful to him for giving way. Would he agree with me that the tone so far of this debate is incredibly disappointing? What we're actually discussing here is something that goes to the very heart of our democratic processes. And if the allegations in this report are correct, it shows there is something rotten at the heart of our democracy, and it would behove the other side to take that rather more seriously, because it affects all of us and affects the credibility with which our democracy is viewed.
Well, I thank her, and I couldn't agree more with her intervention, and I'm sure that others are going to contribute to the debate today, and they may principally or exclusively be from this side of the chamber, and expressing their concerns about these allegations and requiring the matter to be fully investigated in the way that it deserves. Now, I want to, I'll give way one more and then need to concentrate a bit on the speech.
I'm sure if he weren't at the liaison committee, the chairman of the Digital Culture, whatever it's now called, who's done such a fantastic job on this and who's just spent 4 hours listening to the testimony of Christopher Riley, would be here making exactly the same points that he is.
Well, I thank him for that equally helpful intervention, and I hope that during the course of this debate, perhaps members who were able to hear that evidence will also be able to contribute and update the House on what was said there. But clearly, I suspect that a lot of that information would also have been contained in the papers this weekend, which I'm sure many members have spent hours assessing over the weekend and since. So just to focus briefly on the Electoral Commission. So if you go to the Electoral Commission's website, you can see what its role is in relation to referendums. Our focus is on voters and on putting their interests first. Our objectives for referendums are that they should be well run and produce results that are accepted. There should be integrity and transparency of campaign funding and expenditure. Well, I think it's safe to say that neither of those two objectives were met with respect to the EU referendum campaign, and I'm not apportioning blame on the Electoral Commission, I'm apportioning blame on others involved in the EU referendum campaign. So what action have the Electoral Commission taken to date on this? Because, of course, the allegations we've read about this weekend are new allegations, but there are existing allegations that are working their way through the system. Now, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank what do they know and Open Democracy and indeed Fair Vote for the work that they have done on this issue. And they obtained internal emails from the Electoral Commission which described Grimes' spending as unusual. Well, I think we can all agree that the spending by someone whose organisation in the first 10 weeks of its existence managed to raise apparently £107 that's £107, was then given £625,000 to spend. Well, isn't that absolutely remarkable? The confidence that was put in that organisation and that one or two people behind the organisation to spend in a completely uncontrolled manner £625,000. I'm happy to give way.
I think, well, for giving way, I spoke to some people in the industry about this, and they told me that unless there was collusion, it would be impossible to mine such big data in the time frame that that money was given to Believe. Does he not agree with me that this is suspicious indeed?
Well, I don't want to comment directly on that, but clearly that is a very serious allegation which I'm sure will be subject of the Electoral Commission and the police inquiry. And I know that the Electoral Commission have confirmed that there is a live investigation underway, and therefore they're not able to confirm what the progress on it is, but it is underway, and I welcome that. So what they found in these internal emails was the Electoral Commission described his spending as unusual and did find that he broke some of the rules. But the Commission decided to take the matter no further, as there were no reasonable grounds to believe that Vote Leave and Grimes had been working together. Now, I must say that the Electoral Commission will have to have very clear reasons if they do not believe this to be the case now, with these new allegations from 3 whistleblowers at the heart of the Vote Leave Believe machine. And it's worth underlining that these are new allegations, because, of course, what we've heard from the supporters of Vote Leave is that, well, this has all been investigated. No, there's nothing new here. But in fact, these allegations from 3 whistleblowers at the centre of the organisation are completely new. These are matters that have not been investigated. So anyone who is supporting Vote Leave and saying, don't bother, it's been done, are wrong. These are new allegations. And I'm very happy to give way.
Thank you, Honourable Gentleman, for giving way on that point. Does not agree with me that even when the CEO, the former CEO of Cambridge Analytica, which is a subsidiary or associated company Aggregate IQ was linked with many Leave campaigns, was openly bragging that he could alter election outcomes for a fee? Is that not a shaming indictment on the nature of British politics today, and that we could potentially see money being the most important force, not our democracy and force of argument?
Right. I guess I will come on to perhaps some reforms that might be needed in terms of the law, because some of what has gone on, if it is indeed within the law, is something that we should in fact be very, very concerned about, and may need to look very carefully at the law itself. So now the new nature of these allegations is critical. It's critical because the Brexit cheerleaders, like our Foreign Secretary and the Secretary of State for DEFRA, have been very quick to say, nothing to see here, move on, the result must be respected, Vote Leave won fair and square. They will pretend that this has all been investigated before it hasn't. And only when it has will we know whether the trail of deceit, which so publicly started with that incredible slogan slapped on the side of that infamous red bus. When I finish this section, certainly, when that incredible slogan slapped on the side of that infamous red bus, the Foreign Secretary's comprehensively demolished claim of £350 million a week for the NHS, which he keeps repeating to this day, leads directly to today's Cabinet table. I'm happy to give way.
Grateful to the honourable gentleman. When he talks about journeys of deceit, you will notice that there are no members of the Scottish Conservative and Unionist Party joining us today, because it's their former Vice Chair, Richard Cox, who leads a group called the Constitutional Research Council, which gave £425,000 to the Democratic Unionist Party during the last general election. Now, would he join me in asking Mr Cook, first of all, that none of that money came from Russia, and second of all, none of it was used to coordinate other election campaigns, such as the European Union referendum?
Well, he has made a valid point, and indeed those are also very serious allegations that need to be investigated, and which I will touch on briefly in a moment. But I guess one of the things that I have concerns about that donation to the DUP is that it was apparently spent on an advertising campaign that was wholly based in England. And that does seem to be a rather strange use of money allocated to the DUP, which one might rather expect it to have been spent in Northern Ireland.
Where the DUP?
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. Does he agree with me that the Secretary of State for DCMS needs to table urgent amendments to the Data Protection Bill at report stage to give the ICO the additional powers she needs, but also to enhance cooperation between the ICO, the Electoral Commission and the FCA so they can follow the money as well as the data?
Absolutely, and I would add to that that they should be able to follow the money abroad, which I think is a substantial concern in terms of possible involvement of foreign actors in our elections here, and where sources of funding might come from, and indeed where advertising on Facebook and other media might be coming from. I'm happy to give way once more.
For giving way, he's been very generous. He's mentioned a number of investigations underway now with the Electoral Commission. Is it his view that the Electoral Commission can actually undertake the task, or should we be looking at a public inquiry, as has been made the case by the journalist who broke the story?
Well, I thank him for that intervention. I'm open-minded about whether that might be a way forward. My only concern about that is that we have already seen, and I will come on to this, that the Electoral Commission have not proceeded perhaps as swiftly as we would have liked in terms of the investigations that are already underway. And the idea that we might have perhaps a public inquiry, which by definition often take a considerable length of time, if there's much more water under this particular bridge, I think it loses focus. So I think it's important that we focus on this now in a way that delivers an outcome swiftly so that people have certainty about the fairness of our elections. As open democracies state, the referendum saw a number of different groups register as campaigns on each side. These campaigns were given spending caps designed to limit how much the rich can sway our democracy. But if one campaign can simply get round its limit by donating to another on the same side, then the cap verges on meaningless, and so Electoral Commission rules are meant to restrict campaigns from getting round spending limits in this way. So the question, therefore, I've just finished this paragraph, the question, therefore, is whether the Electoral Commission interpreted the law correctly originally and how they will interpret it now with what I believe is substantial new evidence. I'm happy to give way.
Forward to the Honourable Gentleman. Is he aware, in terms of new allegations, that a month before the referendum itself, the Remain campaign set up no fewer than 5 new campaigns: DDB UK Limited, Best for Our Future, The In Crowd, Virgin Management Limited and Wake Up and Vote, channelling £1 million to those 5 organisations? Does he think they should be investigated as well? And if so, why hasn't he mentioned it so far?
I thank him for intervening and making that point. He has already heard from this side of the House a number of members, including me, saying that if there are serious allegations made about either camp, I would love them to be investigated. So I hope that he will bring forward the evidence that he says he has to hand and allow the matter to be investigated thoroughly. Or otherwise he is at risk simply of trying to muddy the water, and I'm sure he's not trying to do that. So the question, therefore, is whether the Electoral Commission interpreted the law correctly originally and how they will interpret it now with what I believe is new evidence. So if they did then interpret the law correctly, then as Open Democracy states, as a registered Leave campaigner, Grimes was allowed to spend £625,000 during the referendum. Earlier this year, a Vote Leave source told a parliamentary committee that it enlisted Mr Grimes' Leave campaign because it was close to breaching its £7 million spending limit and wanted to ensure all the money it had been given would be used. Under UK electoral law, this is fine, apparently. The Electoral Commission has ruled that such donations are allowed so long as there was no plan or other arrangement between Darren Grimes and Vote Leave about how the money was spent. So in other words, one organisation, Vote Leave, can pass a huge amount of money to another just before it would break the legal limit if it carried on spending. That second organisation, although very familiar with the activities of the Vote Leave organisation, indeed co-located with it, using the same supplier for delivering their targeted messages and presumably the same or remarkably similar specification for the work which Vote Leave pays for, the law says that they're not acting in concert. Well, if that is a correct interpretation, or indeed if that is how the Electoral Commission is going to interpret the law once it has considered, once it has considered the new evidence, then I must say I think the law is an ass and would need changing, because what it means in effect is that there is no limit on how much third parties can spend supporting the main designated campaign organisation in any future referendum. I'm happy to give.
Thank you, gentlemen, for giving way. I mean, I'd love to hear what this new evidence, as you put it, is. I mean, it's coming from some very junior people who are, at the moment, giving contradictory claims on different television programmes. I mean, let's hear what it is, and actually, let's leave it to the Electoral Commission to do it. They've already cleared this twice.
Indeed. Well, he clearly perhaps wasn't concentrating on what I said earlier, and I forgive him if that was the case, where I said very clearly that the new evidence is evidence provided by 3 people who are at the heart of Believe and Vote Leave, and in fact were probably the only people who were working for Believe, because let's face it, this was not a large organisation. This was an organisation that had a handful of people working for it. So I suspect they know more about Believe's activities than anyone in this place, and that's why I have indeed referred the matter to the Electoral Commission and the police for them to carry out appropriate investigations. I'm happy to give way to my honourable friend.
I'm grateful to the honourable member for giving way. Given the concerns we're hearing about the potential abuse of electoral law, which is threatening to pull perhaps the most important decision of a generation down into complete farce, the fact that the Court of Session in Edinburgh has said it will allow a petition about Article 50 now to go ahead, the seemingly weekly concerns about Brexit, the vote, the potential economic impact that we might be facing, would the honourable member agree that the wheels are coming off that great big red Brexit bus that he mentioned earlier, and perhaps it's time for the government to stop before it crashes completely?
I thank her. She has carefully enumerated all the different ways in which perhaps some of the promises that were made during the EU referendum campaign have been broken, and the way in which people may now be thinking that a vote on the deal, an exit from Brexit, is the only way out for them. And certainly, I must say that sometimes I wonder if the Prime Minister doesn't feel the same way, because when she seeks to answer questions about what are the economic benefits for the United Kingdom of us doing this, she is sorely short of any sensible answers. So I just wanted to focus briefly on the issue of the Electoral Commission resources. Now, they have, in answer to my letter, confirmed that they do have the resources that they need. Now, I welcome that, and I take their word for it. However, I must say that when I was a minister and had some responsibility for this area, I was aware from contacts with charities, political groups and so on, the Electoral Commission often struggled to respond to queries in a timely manner, and there was always an appetite for more guidance and indeed more detailed guidance. So maybe the resourcing has changed, but they seem to be confident they have got what it needs to investigate this. But we do have, as I expressed earlier, we do have concerns on these benches about the progress that has been made on some of the existing inquiries. Now, as long ago as the 10th of March last year, Lord Tyler in the House of Lords drew attention of the Minister in the Lords to the fact that the Leave campaign stood accused not only of lying in the substance of its campaign, but of cheating in the process of delivering it. He instanced the claim, which others have just referred to, by Aaron Banks, that Cambridge Analytica had played a crucial role in the campaign and won it for Leave. He also described the use of a very substantial anonymous donation to the DUP, which again has been mentioned, to fund a campaign wholly targeted at the British mainland, which I mentioned. I must say that I'm a little bit perplexed as to why, perhaps on the other benches, people do not get aggravated about the fact that in the UK it is fine for a very large anonymous donation to be made to a political party like the DUP, for it then to be spent not in Northern Ireland. I mean, for me, that smells rather bad, and I'm surprised that on the benches opposite there doesn't seem to be similar concerns. I'm happy to give way.
I'm grateful to the honourable member for giving way. I'm sure, like me, he's at least cheered by the fact that some Conservative MPs seem very, very keen to participate in today's debate, despite the fact that 24 hours ago none of them thought there was anything worth debating. But would you agree that when it is something as fundamentally important as the long-term constitution and international status of these islands, that it's not enough for somebody to assert with full of bluster that there is nothing wrong, that all of us, individually and collectively, must be seen to be above suspicion. And if any suspicions are raised in the volume and with the intensity as they have been over the last few days, then there must be a full investigation, hopefully to prove there is nothing amiss. But if there is anything amiss, then those responsible must be held to account, or the public will completely lose any faith in our democracy.
I thank him for that intervention. His point is well made, and he, I'm sure, will join with me and other members in this place who've already expressed very strong views that wherever electoral, or by whoever electoral law is broken, if indeed it is broken, requires investigation and appropriate action needs to be taken. I'm happy to give way.
I thank him for giving way. Doesn't he think that the attitude of the opposite benches is very much that they are so desperate to get Brexit that they are happy to get Brexit even at any price, even at the price of democracy?
Again, well, I don't know whether that is the case for all the members on the other side. We will see if indeed their enthusiasm for the debate leads them to make a contribution where they might set out perhaps their concerns about whether in fact democracy might have been jeopardised if these allegations are true. But they seem to be treating the debate more as a matter of hilarity, so I'm not entirely confident that their contributions will reinforce the points that are being made from this side of the chamber. So I'm now going to ask the Minister some questions which I hope she will be able to answer. And in some respects, I feel sorry for her. I know her to be a very fair minister. I would much rather have had perhaps the Foreign Secretary in her place to answer questions, because he indeed has a lot of questions to answer in this respect, and the role he played in the Vote Leave campaign. So I hope the Minister will be able to explain why the investigations of the existing allegations have taken so long. Is it a question of the Electoral Commission or the police lacking appropriate power or resources? We've heard that the Electoral Commission have said it's not a resource problem. Is there a discrepancy between the different statutory regimes for elections on the one hand and referenda on the other, which cause difficulty in the examinations of infringements? Do these differences cause particular problems when seeking to establish illegal collusion or ineligible donors? Can the Minister set out what action the UK Government intends taking to address any failings in electoral law they have already identified, or the Electoral Commission have already identified, and also set out what mechanisms are in place to right past electoral wrongs? Given the narrow margin of the result, for every 17 people who voted leave, 16 voted to remain, does the Minister recognise that continuing doubts about the referendum's integrity fuels challenges to whole legitimacy of the Brexit process? Is the Minister confident that no one who works for the Conservative Party, or indeed ministers or the Prime Minister, is going to be charged as part of this investigation? Mr. Speaker, I will conclude by saying that whether people voted leave or remain, they are entitled to know that the EU referendum campaign was fairly and squarely delivered, or whether in fact people were cheated and the law was broken. To establish this will require, as many members have said, and from both sides, or all opposition parties at least, it will require a thorough investigation. And I would suggest that this requires ministers to refrain from the Trumpian tweeting preferred by a Foreign Secretary, who has already said that there is no case to answer before the case has actually been heard.
I think the Right Honourable Gentleman has concluded his speech, and we are grateful to him. The question is that this House has considered the EU referendum and alleged breaches of electoral law. Mr. Ben Bradshaw.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker, and can I congratulate the honourable gentleman for securing this emergency debate. As honourable members will know, this is an issue and a concern which I have been raising in this House for nearly 18 months now, and when I first did so I was treated as a bit of a crank. Subsequently, virtually every single allegation that I've used parliamentary privilege to put on the record in this place has proven to have been correct. Mr. Speaker, this is a debate that needs to be taken extremely seriously. It's not about who won or lost the referendum. It's about the integrity and the security of our democracy and our electoral system. And any of the sceptics who've cast doubt on the nature and quality of the evidence of the whistleblower, Chris Wiley, should watch the 4 hours of testimony that I watched today before the Culture, Media and Sport Committee. It was absolutely shocking, astonishing, and it's something that should go to the heart of anybody that cares about our democracy. Now, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Wiley laid out, as the honourable gentleman has said, clear evidence of serious law-breaking by the Leave campaign. Not only collusion between Vote Leave and Be Leave, which is the one that's got most publicity, but collusion between Vote Leave and some of the other Leave organisations, including Veterans for Britain and indeed the DUP. Each of these organisations either used Cambridge Analytica, and we know all about them, having heard the revelations of the last week and how they illegally harvested all of this Facebook data on tens of millions of people. All of these organisations either use Cambridge Analytica or Aggregate IQ, a separate company supposedly based in Canada. It's not separate at all. It's all part of the same organisation. 40% of Vote Leave's budget, 40%, was spent on Aggregate IQ and the work they did. We still don't know how they got that data, where that data came from, whether it was legally obtained and legally used. These are serious questions, and I'm very pleased that the chairman of the Select Committee, who is a Conservative, is clearly taking these allegations very seriously, and he will be putting them to the Prime Minister at the Liaison Committee later this afternoon. Of course, I give way.
I'm very grateful, and along with the investigation into what happened during this referendum, does he not also think, given the scale of the spending now on digital campaigning, that there is an urgent need for a complete overhaul of electoral rules to ensure that it is fit for a digital age?
Yes, I entirely agree with that, and I was going on to say something about that in a little bit later. Mr. Wiley not only provided very compelling and I thought credible evidence of this collusion, but also the effectiveness of the very targeted advertising campaigning that these data companies conduct based on the data that they have. Targeted, in our case in the referendum, on 7 million voters. 7 million voters who they have very carefully profiled as people whose opinions that they can shift. And he gave the staggering statistic to the committee in his evidence today when he said that the methods that Aggregate IQ use in this case, in his experience, had the potential to shift between 7 and 10% of those people targeted. And he said, and I quote, and this is somebody, don't forget, Mr. Speaker, who is a Leaver. He was a Leaver. He remains a Leaver. He wants Brexit to happen, but he doesn't want it to happen based on a fraud on the British electorate. And he said, and I quote to the committee, "It is completely reasonable to say the outcome of the referendum could have been different without this cheating." Now, there have been attempts to try to discredit Mr. Wiley. There was even a disgraceful attempt from Downing Street to discredit one of his co-whistleblowers by outing him as, among other things, by outing him as gay. And I'm amazed that man is still in his job. It's totally, totally unacceptable. Let me tell those people trying to discredit Mr. Wiley, Mr. Wiley is one of 200 people who've been allowed into this country on a visa because of his brilliance. He's been allowed a special visa because of the amount he knows about how all this stuff works. I don't have a clue how it all works, but he is one of the world's leading experts in how this works, and he is a very serious whistleblower. And members of the party opposite, not all of them, but members of the party opposite dismiss his evidence at their peril, because let's just wait and see where all this ends. Now, Mr. Wiley also made a very worrying, and I think this is the first time this connection has been made in my knowledge, although I had heard about it privately, connection between Cambridge Analytica and the Russian FSB via work they did for the Russian oil company Lukoil. Now, it's also clear, and I think must be clear to everybody in this House, whatever their view on Brexit is, that both the Information Commissioner and the Electoral Commission's powers and resources are wholly inadequate. And if the government was serious about doing something about this and getting to the truth and letting them do their job, we want less of this whataboutery. We want more action and support for the Electoral Commission and the Information Commissioner, both in terms of powers, but critically and immediately in terms of resources. One of the very worrying things that Mr Wiley told the committee, and he's been working for hours and hours and hours with the Information Commissioner, he had to explain to the officials of the Information Commissioner what all this was about. They don't have enough technical experts. They don't have people who actually understand how all of this works and what's been going on. I mean, in my view, this guy should be employed by all these global regulators, because he seems to be one of the few people who actually knows how this corruption of not just ours but other countries' electoral purpose. And there was loads of evidence about what's been going on in Nigeria, in parts of the Caribbean. This is not just a problem that affects this country. Yes, of course, I give way.
Thank you, Honourable Friend, for his speech. He's making a very powerful speech. The accusations he's outlining go to the heart of government, and the people that led the Leave campaign are now senior cabinet members. So does my honourable friend agree with me that the ministers in question must excuse themselves from this investigation and possibly Brexit-specific cabinet meetings in the future too?
I think what matters at this stage, Mr Speaker, is that the Electoral Commission, the Information Commissioner, the DCMS Select Committee, the Intelligence and Security Committee, and Robert Mueller's investigation in the United States, which is, don't forget, is also looking in to elements of this that have relevance to us here, are given the full support and the resources from our government and from all of its agencies that they need to do their jobs properly. I also note, however, that in contrast to the outbursts from the Foreign Secretary and the Environment Secretary trying to rubbish this testimony, that most of the rest of the Cabinet said that the Electoral Commission should be allowed to do its work and finish its work properly. I thank
my honourable friend for giving way. Does he agree with me, and does he share my astonishment that it took the Information Commissioner so long to be able to get a warrant so she could search Cambridge Analytica's premises, given that Facebook got in there in a minute and a half?
This is in no way a criticism of the Information Commissioner or of the Electoral Commission. They are doing their best, but they don't have enough people, they don't have enough expertise, and they don't have enough money, and they don't have enough power. I mean, she's absolutely right. The farcical scene of the Information Commissioner trying to get access to Cambridge Analytica's office for almost a week, Facebook having got in right at the start. I mean, it just symbolises for me the paucity of the powers that we have to deal with this digital world. That when we still have legislation and resources that are based on an analogue age. Yes, I give way.
Given today's evidence in the Select Committee, where there was clear linkages between Cambridge Analytica, Facebook, and also GCHQ, that this is now not only a question of imposing on the electoral system, but of national security.
Yep. And I mean, I think any legislator in this House who takes his or her job seriously needs to read the testimony of Christopher Wiley before the committee today. I'll just leave it there. Finally, Mr. Speaker, and this is slightly off the evidence that was given by Mr. Wiley today. I have received other information which is related to this, which is new, which also really concerns me. Honourable members will recall the dreadful murder of Daphne Galizia in Malta last year. At the time that she was murdered, I am informed that Miss Galizia was investigating the Pilatus Bank, which has since been frozen, was frozen last week because of money laundering fears. She was also investigating Cambridge Analytica and Henley Partners. Henley Partners is a company that sells citizenship in Malta. And there are other links here with the Legatum Institute, concerns about which I have already raised in this House several months ago. And the mysterious Maltese professor, Professor Joseph Mifsud, who is named in an indictment by Robert Mueller's inquiry. All of these matters need to look into incredibly carefully, and I would like the Minister, when she responds to this debate, to give me a full and categorical assurance that the Maltese authorities who were investigating this given the very significant British links, will receive the full support and cooperation they need from our law enforcement, intelligence and security agencies. Thank you.
Caroline Lucas.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I have to start by saying I do think it's truly shocking that the government side doesn't seem to think that this debate is worth taking part in. The staggering hypocrisy of MPs...
Point of order, Sir Peter Bottomley. Speaker, could you confirm that listening is taking part in the debate? You don't have to speak to learn.
Well, the right honourable gentleman has made his pithy point pithily, and it's on the record. And people can listen and be attentive. And I have become accustomed to listening to the honourable lady over the years, which I've always found an enjoyable experience. Caroline Lucas. Very well. Point of order, Damien Collins.
Just like to ask you for the record here that I would have applied to speak in this debate, but was chairing 3.5 hours of Select Committee evidence from Chris Wiley this morning.
Although, of course, the debate was granted yesterday, and so there was quite a lot of time yesterday in which to apply to participate. If the honourable gentleman meant he wasn't certain when he would be available because of his pressing commitments, then that point is duly acknowledged. Perhaps we can now proceed with the speech of Caroline Lucas.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I do recognise that the chair of the committee has been doing some incredibly important work this morning. Notwithstanding that, I would still make the case that there is staggering hypocrisy of a large number of MPs who promise to enhance democracy by leaving the EU, in their view, but can't even bother to turn up to talk about the potential radical undermining of our democratic processes. I find that really genuinely quite breathtaking. But I want to start by paying tribute to the dedicated and fearless journalism of Carol Cadwallader over the past year, who has led us to the extraordinary revelations that we are debating this afternoon. Now, much of this discussion so far has been about the validity of the referendum vote itself. But I want to argue that this goes much deeper and much wider than that single vote alone, vastly important though it is. The revelations by The Guardian, by Channel 4 and others over the past few days go right to the heart of the kind of country we think we're living in. I'd argue that they demonstrate that current electoral law is woefully inadequate. I think they show that the regulation governing our democratic processes urgently needs to be updated and reformed. They show, I believe, that something is rotten in the state of our democracy. The combination of big money and big data are overwhelming the chronically weak structures which are supposed to protect us against cheating and fraud. And others have said we are trying to apply laws from the analogue era to the very different reality of the digital age, and it simply is not working. As others have said, it took the Information Commissioner almost a week to get authorisation to get through the front door of Cambridge Analytica, during which time presumably the delete button had presumably been pressed a great many times. The Electoral Commission, meanwhile, has been investigating claims of the misuse of electoral funds for almost a year. Why on earth do we not have rules that means that donations are reported and in real time, and the same for spending? Why do we not have a body with more resources and real teeth? Things urgently need to change. Now, electoral law is based on two fundamental principles. The first is that parties and candidates compete on what should be a level playing field in terms of resources. And that's presumably why we have national and local spending limits in elections. And the second principle is that elections are open and transparent. So parties and candidates have to be transparent in their communications with voters, and it is unlawful to make false claims in those communications. Now, the allegations about the true nature of the relationship between vote leave and believe suggest that there may well have been cheating when it comes to the first principle. And the investigations into Facebook and Cambridge Analytica and the spending of huge sums of money on micro-targeted political advertising based on data harvested from voters' social media profiles, that suggests that the second of those two principles is also under great strain in the digital age. And frankly, Facebook's desperate advertisements on the back pages of Sunday papers just a few days ago suggest to me that they know that their bubble is bursting. And we now need to update the law to ensure people are protected from this social media mega monopoly. Just because the chief executives of Facebook and Google wear T-shirts and turn up to work on skateboards does not mean that they are not aggressive capitalists, and we need to get a little bit wiser to that fact. The law regulating campaign activity and finance, the Political Parties, Elections and Referendums Act, PPERA 2000, was drawn up almost 20 years ago, long before Facebook or Twitter even existed, let alone had any role in political campaigns. And it is considerably more difficult to ensure the compliance of adverts on social media than it is in those in newspapers or on billboards. Voters simply don't know what is being done with their data by a company that ultimately wants to make as much money as possible from the information they have on each one of us. And not surprisingly, the regulators struggle to regulate. Now, this undoubtedly does present a complex challenge to all politicians as social media platforms overtake the more traditional national and local press and media through which we've traditionally communicated with our electorate, but without the same level of transparency and scrutiny. However, it is a challenge that we must meet. The need for a reprogramming of the way parties and campaigns are funded could not be greater. And whether it's donations from Russian oligarchs on one side of the House or former Formula One bosses on the other side, people are sick and tired, I think, of a politics that is awash with big money without oversight. And I would argue that the case for state funding for political parties could scarcely get any stronger.
I'm very grateful to the honourable friend for giving way. Does she share my concern that the House voted for DUP's donation to not be scrutinised before 2017, so that that massive donation now cannot be scrutinised in the proper way? We do not know the origin of that cash.
Well, I absolutely share the concerns of the honourable lady. She is quite right that that should have been looked at the time, and it should not just simply have been pushed into the long grass as it has been. And that is yet another reason why I am calling today for urgent cross-party talks on updating our online campaign regulations, reforming the PPERA Act of 2000, including consultation with the Electoral Commission and the Information Commissioner on what new powers and resources they need in order to fulfil their role in safeguarding our democracy. The revelations by Shamir Sani about Vote Leave and Believe, however, raise a related but somewhat different set of questions, some of which need to be addressed to and answered by certain members opposite. For they do strongly suggest that some of those who worked for the official Brexit campaign during the 2016 referendum, some of whom now work for the Prime Minister in Downing Street, committed criminal breaches of electoral law on overspending and on collusion. Vote Leave, whose leading members included the current Foreign Secretary and Environment Secretary, formally declared it had spent £6.77 million during the 2016 campaign, within the £7 million limit. But that sum does not include a £625,000 donation that Vote Leave gave to Believe, the Brexit campaign aimed at students and young people, and which Believe spent on the very same digital marketing company, Aggregate IQ, that was used by Vote Leave. And there is, as the right honourable member next to me has set out very powerfully in his opening words, there is substantial evidence of constant communication between Vote Leave and Believe, who are based in the same office, shared the same computer drive, seem to have advice going between them about the setting up of their constitution, their bank account, and so on and so forth. Frankly, it is insulting to suggest that these two organisations were not coordinating very, very closely. So it is simply not good enough for the Prime Minister to have airily dismissed the questions that were raised by these revelations, as she did in the House yesterday. And I might add that her attempts to brush off complaints about the disgraceful outing of Shamir Sani were beneath her and bring shame on her office. If the laws were broken, then those involved need to be brought to justice, because if they are not, and if we do not fix the shortcomings of our electoral law and its regulation, this government will go down in history as the one who sat and watched while the very lifeblood of our democracy drains away, and voters will have taken back control for nothing. And that's why I also think we need an independent public inquiry to establish as a matter of urgency whether electoral law was broken by any of those working for Vote Leave and Believe, and crucially what current government ministers knew at the time.
Thank you. Heidi Alexander.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I start by congratulating the honourable member for Carshalton and Wallington for securing this debate and the way in which he opened our deliberations today. And can I also pay tribute to my right honourable friend, the member for Exeter. He suggested that some people think that when he first started raising these issues in Parliament that they perceived him to be something of a crank. I actually personally think that he is one of the finest politicians of our generation, and I'm very proud to sit on these benches alongside him. There are so many things that need to be said in this debate. It is quite hard to know where to start. The three contributions that we have heard so far have all made reference to the recent revelations about the close relationship between the Vote Leave campaign and the Believe campaign, and what that might mean for the ongoing debate about Brexit and the referendum. I agree with all of what has been said. There are serious questions that need to be fully investigated by the Electoral Commission, and no stone should be left unturned in understanding who knew what and when. Having said that, I want to make some different observations about what recent events suggest about our politics and our democracy. At heart, I fear that there have been appalling and repeated abuses of power. What seems to have gone on within the various different elements of the Leave campaigns just doesn't sound right. People with years of experience dealing with campaign volunteers, some barely out of university, advising them on setting up a separate legal entity through which serious funds end up being channelled, at a time when some of the individuals in question are having a campaign fling, only for that relationship to be outed 18 months or so later in a statement from Number 10. The whole thing stinks. Yeah. I don't know whether criminal offences have been committed. I don't know whether electoral law has been broken, but I'm pretty sure, though, that people have abused their power. I may be naive, but I am a firm believer in decency in public life. Doing the right thing, even if it may not be to your own immediate personal interest or to your party's or your campaign's electoral advantage. Some people would say, I'm not cut out to be a politician. Perhaps I'm not. But this insidious, cynical, arrogant, perpetual game playing has to stop. It has real consequences for real people's lives. It will also kill our democracy. I'm sick of it. Perhaps it's my upbringing, but I've got some pretty basic values, Mr. Speaker. You don't lie. If you do something wrong, you admit it. You treat people the way you would want to be treated yourself. You respect the law, the letter of it, as well as the spirit of it. You play fair, you don't play dirty. In having power, your primary duty is to exercise it responsibly. I've read the reports in the last few days. I'm afraid I won't. I've read the reports, and if he wishes to make a speech and a contribution to this debate, which has been so sadly lacking from these benches, then I know he will have time today to do so. I've read the reports in the last few days. I've looked at some of the emails that were exchanged between some of the key players, and I'm worried that what I see is a corrosive abuse of power. Yeah. If we want the British people to have faith in us, we need to find a way to conduct our politics with decency. I fear the opposite is the case at the moment, and it has to stop.
Yeah. Order. Can I just say to the Right Honourable Gentleman, the member for Kingston and Surbiton, that I am not in receipt of an application from him to speak in this debate, whereas others have applied. I know that he's a figure of considerable celebrity in his constituency and is a divisible proposition, but arguably within the House. And I'm sure I will be happy to hear him. But in case he wonders, he has a habit of looking at me astonished that he hasn't been called immediately. Why I'm not calling him immediately, I just very gently say to the Right Honourable Gentleman, other people, also busy with many commitments and very full diaries, have actually got round to applying to speak. So he'd better wait, and then we can look forward to his eloquence and erudition. Geraint Davis.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I think it's absolutely amazing that the Foreign Secretary isn't in his place, given the gravity of accusations being made and the pivotal part and the centrality of him personally in them. He has said that these allegations are ludicrous. He has said that it's farcical. He said that the vote was won legally, there was fair play. And frankly, what we've already heard and what we know shows that these basic assumptions are cast into question, and these issues need to be looked at very carefully. What we're talking about here is the electoral law on which our democracy is based. And what people watching this debate are asking themselves is, was the referendum a cheat? Was it based on a lie? Were the economic dice loaded with illegal and dark money? Were the electorate cynically manipulated by Cambridge Analytica, who illegally harvested Facebook data without people knowing it and manipulated their choices into a journey now that's going to take us into economic Armageddon, frankly? Yes, I will.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. Yesterday in the Russia debate, I called on the government to pull together a Russia Commission so that we could have a root and branch examination of where Russia has not only interfered in our elections, but has also interfered in our economic system, our legal system, and our accounting systems. Would he agree that the problem we have at the moment is the Electoral Commission and the Information Commissioner lack the powers and the numbers of staff to carry out the sort of level and depth of inquiry we need?
Yes, I would certainly agree with that last point. They're going to have a great deal of difficulty evaluating the role of Cambridge Analytica and the dirty money involved. The Russian question is a much bigger question. There are questions around whether the targeted bombing of innocent civilians in Syria to the run-up to Brexit, in the knowledge that the Germans were allowing 1 million refugees in, was instrumental in the result of Brexit, and whether that was intentional. There are questions about whether President Trump got elected through the influence of the Russians. There are questions about whether the fascists in France got a third of the vote due to the Russians. There are questions about how they influenced the German elections, and there's certainly questions about how they influenced this. But I would suggest I will limit my comments here rather to the issues about Cambridge Analytica and the abuse and manipulation of British voters by them and the money, the dirty money behind that. I would say, and I will, just before calling the honourable gentleman, that people seem to have the misconception that the Brexit vote was a close vote. Well, it was not a close vote, rather. But I put it to you, Mr. Speaker, that if you ushered 33 people into a room and 17 voted one way and 16 another way, that is the most marginal vote you could get. And that vote can be swayed by Cambridge Analytica and the other manipulation. And it is in sharp contrast to the natural and rightful instincts of British people that this is simply not fair play. I will take the intervention.
Well, gentlemen, the honourable lady, the member for Bridgend, I think made an important point about the power of the Information Commissioner to investigate these matters, because he raises serious issues in his remarks. But often the Electoral Commission and the Information Commission in particular do not have the power to go behind the curtain and take data that they require to support their investigations. They're still largely reliant on companies complying with information notices, which over the last few weeks we've seen what a frustrating process that can be.
Yes, I mean, that's an excellent point, well made. And obviously it brings into question what further powers should they have, or what further powers should be used to others have to bring the information they need to reach their legitimate concerns and to conclude in that. Certainly will, yeah.
I thank him for good well. On this issue of data, is he aware that one of the other allegations that is made is that, in fact, after the first inquiries carried out by the Electoral Commission, where they found no case to answer, that some of the people who are now at number 10 allegedly went onto databases to unlink certain documents so that it appeared as though they were perhaps not available to everybody on both the Vote Leave and the Be Leave campaign. Is he concerned by that?
Right, Davis.
Well, I'm profoundly concerned by that. Again, the facts are emerging day by day, and they need to be interrogated forensically It is very important that the resources are there to do this, and that sort of information coming forward gives us greater reason to have an enormous concern over this. And that is why, Mr. Speaker, I'm saddened to see that the benches opposite are empty when the essence of our democracy, as we are about to step on the biggest journey forward that we've seen.
Order. Point of order, Sir Peter Bottomley.
I don't want to cast any aspersions on the honourable member's ability to see, but if you can't see these benches are not empty, if you can see, you shouldn't say they're empty. If you can see they're full, you shouldn't say so.
The benches are not empty. The right honourable gentleman has made his point, and I invite the honourable gentleman to continue his speech.
Yes, as a point of information, one moment. I'm still dealing with the last intervention. For the record, the benches are virtually empty. And basically, I don't know, 1% full, and it's frankly pathetic. So I am very grateful for that pointing out that the opposition don't seem to care about the integrity of democracy and the law, and I will take the intervention.
When it comes to the question of fairness, does the honourable gentleman think it was entirely fair that whilst the Remain camps and the Vote Leave camps were allowed to spend £7 million each, the government spent £9 million of taxpayers' money, £9 million of taxpayers' money to convince people to vote Remain? Whether he thinks that's fair or not, it obviously made no or very little difference. And therefore all these arguments are grossly exaggerated. The British people have the good sense to make up their own mind.
Well, if he's suggesting because one side spent more than the other side, it's all right for the other side to behave illegally, then I don't think that's a very persuasive argument. This behaviour, the manipulation of people's views through a clandestine way that they didn't realise through Facebook and elsewhere, plus the dirty money, casts into question the very integrity of a democracy and the decision that was made. That influence may have been pivotal, but I would suggest that even if it wasn't pivotal, Mr. Speaker, if when asked, would an Olympic athlete have won a race had he not been doped up? And you might come to the conclusion, well, maybe he would, well, maybe he wouldn't. But the point is, he would be or she would be disqualified, quite rightly so. The British people want fair play, they want the rule of law, and that has been fundamentally cast into doubt. Even before this unhappy episode, people were already saying that the Foreign Secretary had, stood in front of a bus claiming we'd spend £350 million a week, said, he'd vote for the single market and favoured it, and now he says he doesn't, said we take back control, and of course we haven't had democratic control in this space, has been given to ministers. And so people are saying, hold on, that's not what we voted for. They're questioning whether there is a legitimacy in what's been happening, and they're saying to me, certainly in Swansea, what they now want is in terms of fair play, to have a vote on the deal, to check it does satisfy what they were promised. But now we're in a completely different ballpark. We're saying not only were they misled, but they were manipulated, cynically manipulated through Facebook's millions of voters using dirty money. So the British people are sort of saying, well, hold on, let's have another look at this. They're already saying to me, as to everybody, the whole process, this Brexit process, is taking too long, it's costing too much, they didn't know the facts, it's terribly complicated, the EU are running rings around us, the UK are incapable of negotiating properly, it's very complicated. There's a problem here, and there needs to be a solution. And that solution, they're saying to me, is that they want a public vote on the deal. And now this, the Cambridge Analytica, is just completely in breach of fair play. And anybody who thought, well, actually, it would be unfair to have a vote on the deal, we've had a vote, now realises what fair play demands is to move forward and have a final vote on the deal. People like the Brexit Secretary have always said, oh, well, democracy isn't democracy unless it has the right to change its mind, and I agree. People like Nigel Farage have said, oh, well, it wouldn't be a settled, it would be unfinished business if the vote was 52-48. We need a two-thirds majority. People like the member for, what is his name now, member for Somerset, Moggy, He said we should have a second...
Order. The honourable gentleman shouldn't refer to a colleague in that way. I think the person he has in mind is the honourable gentleman, the member for North East Somerset. Yes. Yeah, well, that's the proper way to refer to it. Continue.
Yeah, I'm glad. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm glad I prompted you because I couldn't remember the North East, so I inadvertently said Moggy. I'm sorry about that. So he, in fact, is on the record as saying perhaps there should be a second referendum when the renegotiation is completed. And so, as we go through this unhappy episode and find that we've had electoral breaches. There's a breach in our inherent democracy, there's questions over the legitimacy of the referendum, and there's a need for fair play. People are now saying, well, should Facebook and Google have these sorts of powers? Shouldn't they be politically and publicly, they should be publicly, as opposed to politically, publicly regulated, as they are becoming very much instrumental in our democracy, and we need to overturn that so the public and our democracy can be protected. Finally, Mr. Speaker, people who were 13 during that referendum will be 18 by the time the plan now is to leave. Surely their futures are paramount. Many of the people, sadly, who voted won't be with us any longer. But now we are seeing that those votes are cast into doubt in terms of the legitimacy. Surely there's a compelling case that the public should have a vote on the deal in terms of fair play, and we should move forward, refresh, renew our democracy, and do the right thing for Britain.
Very good. Sir Edward Davey.
Mr. Speaker, I am most grateful for you allowing me to catch your eye without a written application to the Chair. And if I may, in humbly apologising to you, realise that I had thought the Conservative benches would make speeches in the 2 hours that you had, up to 2 hours that you had allocated to this debate. But we've had not a single speech from the Conservative benches. That's why I hadn't written to you, sir, because I didn't think you would need an extra speech. But I do think it's important that the Conservative benches hear the allegations that are made, because they are very deep allegations. And I would say, I give way to an honourable lady.
I thank the honourable member for giving way, and I would have liked to have spoken in this debate had I not had other matters to be participating in. But isn't it astounding that the only contributions we've heard thus far from the other side have been the whataboutery, trying to draw equivalence with other matters, that actually, on the critical issue that we are addressing today, we've heard nothing. Not one member on the other side has found it in themselves to address this issue, which is at the heart of our democracy.
He is absolutely right. And what is astounding is actually this debate is more than about Brexit. Because the issues being raised in this debate are bigger than Brexit. They're about our democracy, how it works. But they're actually about parliamentary sovereignty and the rule of law. And I had thought that Conservative members, particularly the Brexit Conservatives, had wanted to pull us out of the EU in order to defend parliamentary sovereignty and the rule of law as they describe it. But they're not here to defend that rule of law today, which is what is so shocking about the failure of them to speak and make speeches. I give way to the honourable lady.
I thank the honourable member for giving way. Would he agree that if we ignore this, if we don't take this apart and examine it in full, it is allowing a criminalisation of our democracy? That's what's at risk here, and we must acknowledge that. No matter how inconvenient a truth it is, we must absolutely get to the bottom of this.
Well, of course, the honourable lady is absolutely right. If the law has been broken in this serious way that is alleged, then that will be a criminal offence. And therefore, this House, given a criminal offence, would have been committed in relation to a massive vote that has huge constitutional changes. Surely this is such a serious matter that you would have thought that right honourable and honourable members from all sides would have wanted not just to listen, but to participate. The honourable gentleman wanted to intervene.
Very grateful to the right honourable gentleman for giving away. Would he accept these points? That during the referendum campaign, the government was in favour of us remaining in the European Union, a position I shared. The Conservative Party took a corporate stance to be neutral in that referendum campaign. The Leave campaign, just as the Remain campaign, has ceased to exist as legal entities, and any allegations made against either campaigning organisation in that referendum is best dealt with by the Electoral Commission and not by Parliament. This is not for the government to answer, because this is not a government policy.
I find the intervention of the honourable gentleman rather odd. First of all, it's in the tradition that we're seeing this debate from the Conservative benches of a whataboutery statement. But also, surely I would have thought the honourable gentleman would have wanted this House to hear and debate these allegations. They are in the public domain, they are in the press, the public are talking about them, and it's vital that the elected members of this House get a chance to debate it. And that's why I'm so grateful for my right honourable friend for having won this debate, and how proud I am of the Liberal Democrats for actually calling this debate. And I give way to my right honourable friend and then the honourable gentleman.
I mean, just following that point of order, I mean, isn't it the case that the government, in fact, do need to answer, because some of the very prominent cabinet ministers were at the centre of these allegations?
Well, my right honourable friend anticipates a line of argument that I wish to come onto in due course. He's absolutely right, though, that the Foreign Secretary and the Secretary of State for DEFRA were closely involved in the Vote Leave campaign, and we need to know whether these allegations go indeed to the very top table. I give way to the honourable gentleman.
In the spirit of fairness, and I shouldn't be doing the Conservative bench's job for them, but the honourable member who probably has done more than most, and certainly more than me, and who knows more than most about this, is the chairman of the Digital Culture, Media and Sport Committee, who couldn't take part in the debate because he was hearing this vital evidence from Chris Wylie, and he will be doing his job, I'm sure, very adequately in front of the Prime Minister later this afternoon. We need to approach this in as consensual a way as we can, because this is not about party politics, it's about the integrity and the security of our electoral system.
I agree with the right gentleman, both about the efforts and expertise that the chair of the Select Committee is bringing to that inquiry, and how important that is to this whole debate, but also the need to try to go across both party divisions and the divisions that we saw both in the referendum campaign and after the referendum campaign. I've been contacted by Leave voters who are very disturbed about these allegations. That many of the Leave voters, very patriotic people, believe that one of the key traditions and values of this country is that we respect the rule of law and that we do not allow cheats to prosper. And therefore, I do think actually this is an issue which can bring Parliament together and can bring both sides together. And whoever cheated during the referendum, if anyone cheated, they need to be held to account. I give way.
But with respect, he's not answered the point made by my honourable friend. And the point is this, that of course he's right. He's entitled to give his speech, Parliament's entitled to debate it, but the question we want him to answer is this: who should decide? Who should decide whether to take action? Is it the government, which was party pre, which took one side of this debate during the referendum, or should it be an independent body, named the Electoral Commission? Who should make the final decision?
Of course, there could be a number of bodies that ultimately look at the different accusations. We have a live investigation by the Electoral Commission, and we await that. My right-hand friend spoke very much about the Electoral Commission in his opening speech. We have the investigations by the Information Commissioner and her office in relation to the related allegations with respect to Cambridge Analytica and aggregate IQ. So there are those investigations. Many of us feel that the evidence so far, because there could be a criminal act, suggests that the police should be investigating these organisations. I certainly am not suggesting, let me be absolutely clear, that government ministers are responsible for investigation. That would not meet my requirements for an inquiry, I can assure you.
On this point, doesn't he agree, and the point has been made previously, that yes, it is an independent body that investigates, but yes, maybe we actually need to update the law and do something here in Parliament in order to adequately respond to these things in the future.
Well, indeed, and what I believe Parliament can do, and indeed I've written to the chair of the Home Affairs Select Committee, Mr Speaker, to ask whether her committee could hold a parliamentary committee inquiry into the different aspects that aren't covered by the inquiry of the Select Committee for Culture, Media and Sport, because I seriously think that this House needs to augment and support those investigations by those independent bodies. We have powers in this House to bring people to the bar, to discuss, to give evidence, and I think that is the right and proper thing to do. I'm happy to give way.
Gentlemen, doesn't he also think it's an irony? The government who was so keen on the Lobbying Act to such a degree that small charities around the country were very frightened of intervening near elections. The same government that is introducing voter identification and all sorts of ID simply so that they'll catch the 29 people or however many it was that committed electoral fraud last time. And yet they seem remarkably lacking in concern over this.
I think the Honourable Lady makes a very good point. And the fundamental issue here is, did people in the Leave campaign cheat? It's this cheating issue. Did they break the law? And that's what we need to focus on. And it was the Honourable Gentleman Member for Swansea West who made the analogy with athletes and with sport. If athletes dope, Mr. Speaker, we expect that to be investigated and then to be punished, whether or not that cheating affected the result of a race or any competition. And it's that cheating and the breach of the law that needs to be followed through, whether or not that relates to the outcome of the referendum. I give way to the Honourable Gentleman.
Would you agree with me that if government ministers, and I'm thinking specifically of the Foreign Secretary and the Environment Secretary, are implicated in any illegal activities, if they are the dopers in the analogy he's using, that they should not be above the law, and that when the police are doing their investigation, they should not be intimidated from putting forward a legal case against ministers, irrespective of their position in this place?
Well, in responding to the Honourable Gentleman, let us be clear, these are all allegations. We need proper authorities to investigate. But of course, if those investigations go to the door of any member of this House, be they a minister or not, then of course the full weight of the law should go against that individual. No member of this House should be above the law in those investigations. But if I may, Mr. Speaker, I want to be a little clearer than the debate's been so far about how we are thinking, or how the Electoral Commission, as key to this, would think about whether there has been cheating. Because the Electoral Commission's guidelines on this are quite clear about whether a campaign has colluded. And there are a number of tests they set out about whether campaigns are highly likely to be working together. And there are three criteria that they set out. First of all, whether the campaigns spend money on joint advertising campaigns, leaflets or events. That's the first one. Well, the evidence brought forward by Fair Vote, which can be seen by anyone at fairvote.uk, the evidence brought forward suggests that Vote Leave and Believe appear to have coordinated with the same digital strategy vendor, Aggregate IQ. So there does seem to have been a coordination between their advertising campaigns. The second test the Electoral Commission set forth is this: whether campaigns have coordinated their spending with another campaigner. The evidence produced by Fair Vote is very clear. It shows that Believe appears to have been assigned specific responsibility for the youth audience by Vote Leave. Specific responsibility by Vote Leave. That is coordination and collusion, Mr. Speaker. And the third test on cheating set out by the Electoral Commission is whether another campaigner can approve or has significant influence over the spending of another campaign. And this dossier shows, again, that Believe was based at Vote Leave HQ, as we've heard, and appears to have reported to Vote Leave directors and shared all information with their staff. In other words, Mr. Speaker, the three tests put forward by the Electoral Commission about whether illegal collusion occurred appear to be met according to the evidence in this dossier, which I do urge all right honourable members to read and to think about before they tweet in the way we saw for the Foreign Secretary, who dismissed these allegations as ludicrous at the weekend. Well, he might well have tried to dismiss them, Mr. Speaker, because if these allegations prove to be true, if the investigations, inquiries that we all seek to want to follow on from this debate, from this public discussion, they may well want to ask the Foreign Secretary questions, because he was ultimately in charge of the Vote Leave campaign. He was a key player in the Vote Leave campaign. And people will want to know whether he knew about this collusion. Did he know that monies were going from Vote Leave to Believe? Did he know that the staff of both campaigns were colluding and working together? Did he know that aggregate IQ was being used by both campaigns in a very similar way? Very serious allegations, but we need to see the independent inquiries. And the same questions, of course, could be applied to the Secretary of State for DEFRA. But I would also want, Mr. Speaker, to ask the Prime Minister whether she has asked the Foreign Secretary, her Foreign Secretary, and her Secretary of State for DEFRA about what they knew. Because the Prime Minister ought to be, if she's in charge of her government, asking her very own ministers what they knew, given the severity of and gravity of these allegations now in the public domain. And if she is not getting good enough answers from the Foreign Secretary and the Secretary for DEFRA, she should be taking action. There is another issue, Mr. Speaker, with regard to what the Prime Minister's responsibilities, namely that she has key members of staff in Number 10 who are staffers in these campaigns who appear to be part of the alleged collusion. And at the very least, she should be asking them questions and getting assurances from them, and if those assurances aren't good enough, she should take the appropriate action, Mr. Speaker. I would like to ask the Minister, does the Foreign Secretary speak for the government on this when he pushes aside these allegations as nonsense? Is that what the Minister is going to say at the dispatch box in a few minutes? Does she, speaking on behalf of Her Majesty's Government, agree with the Foreign Secretary that these allegations are all complete nonsense before they've been investigated? Before, Mr. Speaker, they've been investigated. This is quite an extraordinary position for Her Majesty's Government to take, and particularly for the Foreign Secretary to take. He's supposed to speak for this country about the rule of law in other countries, and one wonders, doesn't one?
Would you give way?
Happy to give way.
Does he not think it's also telling that the Foreign Secretary put out that statement as soon as the news broke on last Friday evening? He can't possibly have read the 3 huge files of documentation that have been presented to the Electoral Commission and the ICO of evidence, can he?
Well, one does wonder about people connected to the Vote Leave campaign who've tried to get in their rebuttals and their answers rather rapidly. We saw from the manager, the head of the Vote Leave campaign in terms of the staff side, Mr. Dominic Cummings, putting a pre-rebuttal out before the allegations had been in the public domain. It sounds like he knew quite a lot of what the allegations were going to be. Perhaps he knew the truth, Mr. Speaker. I'm afraid his pre-rebuttal did not convince anybody. And now we have the allegations and the detailed evidence of emails and photograbs of things that have since been deleted. We now know why Mr. Cummings is desperate to try to get his rebuttal in. And I can't know whether the Foreign Secretary was in the same position, but one has to have one's suspicions raised, Mr. Speaker. So it's because these allegations are so grave, affecting the most momentous decision that this country has taken since the Second World War, that we are absolutely right from these benches, supported by all colleagues in the opposition, to ask these questions of the government. Just because there's no division after this debate, Mr. Speaker, does not make these questions and this debate something that the government can push aside. I say to the Minister today, we will be coming back to this and back to this until we have answers. And when the Electoral Commission report, when the Information Commissioner's reports, and hopefully when the police report, then we will need to have those published and debated here again in this House. We will not let this lie. Why? Because we want to defend British democracy. We want to defend parliamentary sovereignty. We want to defend the rule of law. And I hope the Minister is going to go up to the dispatch box shortly and say that's what she's going to do too.
Thank you. Tommy Shepherd.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I congratulate the Right Honourable Member for Carshalton for bringing this debate today, and I find myself in agreement both with what he has said and with most of the speakers on these benches. I have a direct personal interest in this, Mr. Speaker, not one I need to declare under the Code of Conduct, but because I have direct experience of operating in a campaign under the very regulations which we're talking about today. In the summer of 2014, I was an activist and a campaigner in the Scottish independence referendum. And because of my history and background in the entertainment industry, I was part of a group that was trying to coordinate that campaign amongst the arts and cultural industry in Scotland. And one of the things we wanted to do in that group was to organise a major high-profile concert in the run-up to the event in order to demonstrate the support that was there and in order to provide a fillip for the campaign in the final days. We went to the Yes Scotland campaign, which was the designated organisation with this proposal, and they said that it wasn't something they wanted to include in their campaign plan and spend money on, and they advised us to go away and do it ourselves. So that is what we did. And I registered my own events company with the Electoral Commission as a permitted participant in the organisation. We hired the Usher Hall, the grandest concert hall in Edinburgh, we booked the bands, we arranged the production, we arranged the publicity, and we had a very successful event. And afterwards, we provided to the Electoral Commission a report and a detailed budget of what we had spent and the money that we had received. And at no stage did we either report to or seek the involvement of the official designated organisation. I'm happy to give way.
I thank him for giving way, and I'm sure that when he was considering what action to take, he would never, for instance, have considered co-locating with the designated organisation. He would never considered sharing a server. He would probably not have considered using the same supplier on the same basis as the designated organisation.
The right honourable gentleman is ahead of me because I was going to say I have had cause over recent weeks to wonder what if we had done it differently. What if rather than do it that way, the designated campaign organisation had come to me and said, we'd like you to do this activity, and the best way to do it, because we don't want it in our budget, is we'll set up a separate organisation, and just to make it easier for you, our lawyers have done the paperwork in order to set up the organisation, and just to make it easier for you, you can have our staff and you can work out of our office, and just to make it even easier for you, you don't need to bother about writing the cheques, because we will book and pay for the hall and the production. What would have happened if we'd done it that way, I wonder? Well, I have no doubts what would have happened. The Electoral Commission would have investigated. They would have found myself and Yes Scotland in breach of the regulations. Yeah. We would have been fined and we would have been reported to the Procurator Fiscal for prosecution and criminal charges. And I say that, Mr. Speaker, because that lived experience frames my opinion of these events that we're talking about today. And my opinion is that this stinks to high heaven. I have looked in preparation for this debate at the original investigation and judgments of the Electoral Commission to these complaints and I would recommend members do this, at the High Court judgment on the application for judicial review of that decision. And what it comes down to, what is absolutely central in this debate, is not whether there were different campaign organisations arguing for vote leave, but whether they colluded together in order to breach the expenditure limits that were set down. That is what is central to this. And if you look at the High Court judgment and other documents, it's clear that the most important thing here is whether or not there was a common plan in existence between vote leave and bee leave as defined under the 2000 Act. And I have to say that when you have a situation where vote leave sets up a subsidiary organisation called bee leave, uses its own personnel to go and establish it, manages to send its lawyers and all sorts of support, provides its offices and computers and drives on the server for the same people, then it is very, very difficult indeed to escape the conclusion that there was collusion and organisation between the two. We are being asked to believe that Darren Grimes took a £600,000 contract and went to a data analytics firm in Canada completely independently of people in vote leave who had already spent £2.7 million with the very same company. It is literally, Mr. Speaker, unbelievable. Absolutely right. And I think we need to support the Electoral Commission and others in investigating this to the bottom. Now, we are aware of this. I'm happy to give way if we have time.
For giving way, does he not agree with me that what would be even worse than any of this is if we come to the Electoral Commission comes to the conclusion that they can't prove it? And that says to me that there is something fundamentally wrong with the laws under which they are operating. And that is what this debate is about. How do we stop this from happening again, should they not be found to have been colluding?
Indeed, and I think we will have to wait the outcome of the Electoral Commission's investigation before we consider whether the legal framework and the support which is provided for the Electoral Commission is in fact adequate to this task. But I wanted to state also, Mr. Speaker, that we have this new evidence. I mean, the Electoral Commission had already reopened the investigation, by the way, before the whistleblowing information that has come out in the last 7 days. But we are surely indebted to Shamir Sani for what he has done in the service of democracy in this country. And I've watched his video recordings, and it's clear that we don't share the same point of view. We didn't share the same point of view on Brexit during the campaign. We don't share it now. But I don't think that anyone who watches those interviews can fail to be moved by the decency, the integrity and the bravery of that young man in coming forward and putting himself at risk. And I think we owe him a great debt. And it does therefore worry me, the response of our government to these whistleblowing allegations. And others have mentioned this, but I think the Prime Minister's explanation yesterday that this was a personal statement made by Stephen Parkinson just doesn't hold water. How can it be a personal statement when someone is at a desk in number 10 Downing Street at the heart of government on the payroll and issues a statement from number 10 Downing Street? This must be the first occasion in history, certainly that I can remember, where the government has decided to attack a whistleblower by outing them as gay, causing them the possibility of actual harm to themselves and their family, and it is a disgrace. Happy to go forward.
Is he also aware that, according to reports, that statement was approved by the Prime Minister's Chief Communications Officer, Robbie Gibb? No way that that was not an official statement, as the Prime Minister claimed yesterday.
I agree, and on the email it says official. So, I mean, there can be no question that the Prime Minister didn't know what Stephen Parkinson was saying. And I have to say, I've written to the government today to demand that this young man be apologised to for the actions that have been taken. And I have to say, that is the very least that we can expect. Most reasonable people in this country will be wondering why Stephen Parkinson has not already been sacked, quite frankly. And in many other companies or areas of life, that is exactly what would happen. I'm happy to take a...
Giving way. Look, let the Electoral Commission do it. Why is this House trying to preempt it? No one should be sacked until we actually have a decision.
I was not talking about the Electoral Commission investigation just there. I was not talking about the allegations of collusion between Vote Leave and Believe. I was talking about a senior official of the government exposing somebody for being gay in response to them blowing the whistle on what has been happening in government. And that speaks to the character of this government, and they have, I think, hours rather than days to try and claw back in this and put something right. And I would hope when the Minister gets to her feet that she will make a statement that the government will respond to these concerns and will speak to Mr Parkinson and, if necessary, take the appropriate action. I have to say myself, I can't see any other action that would be possible but to say this man is no longer fit to hold office in government. Mr Speaker, what happens when the Electoral Commission has its investigation and comes to its conclusion? Well, of course, one of the things that happens is that even if the collusion is proven, even if the regulations have been breached, this is not going to change the result of the referendum. It will not be overturned. And of course, there are some people on the pro-Brexit side who seem to believe that the referendum was mandatory on Parliament and the government. It never was in the first place. It was an advisory referendum. So even if its result were to be challenged, it doesn't actually call into question the many decisions in terms of Article 50 and leaving the European Union that this Parliament has already voted on. But I do believe, Mr Speaker, that it does add further poison to the well of British democracy, because it comes on top of the most mendacious campaign in political history that was fought in 2016, where people were lied to about what it meant to leave the European Union. And on top of that, not only were these lies told and written on the not worth the bus that they were written on, frankly, but we also now have a situation where the regulations and the laws governing the conduct of that may have been broken. Mr Speaker, I think the Minister needs to reassure us that the Electoral Commission will have all of the resources that they require in order to get to the bottom of this matter. But I have to say also, I think there is already enough evidence, because I presume these statements from the whistleblowers will be sweared to under oath. There is already enough evidence for this matter to be referred to the Crown Prosecution Service and for a police investigation to take part. And what that police investigation needs to do is to interview under caution the players in this debate, the players in this scenario, including those who now sit in government holding the highest offices of the land. Which brings me, Mr. Speaker, to the Foreign Secretary, who has chosen not to be present here today. Others have commented about how quick off the mark the Foreign Secretary was to denounce the allegations, to denounce the new information. And I am left wondering whether this was just his attempt to be the English Donald Trump, or whether, in fact, this is someone using one of the highest offices of the land to bring their power and authority to bear to intimidate those who will criticise him and make these allegations. And that is very worrying indeed. And I want an assurance from the government today that if the Electoral Commission finds that there has been collusion and breach, then that those cabinet ministers who were involved in the management of the Vote Leave campaign will resign from office and will take no further part in government, because it would be ridiculous, and I think it would undermine the credibility of the Foreign Secretary and others to have been involved in this breach of our electoral law and to then seek to hold the highest office of the land. And finally, Mr. Speaker, I want to just refer to my honourable friend from Western Bartonshire, who raised a very important matter as well. Because I think as we uncover this, we will find more traces of dark money creeping into our electoral system. And we need to have the utmost transparency if we are to resist this. And so therefore I invite the Minister also to comment on what action she and her colleagues will be taking with regard to the Constitutional Research Council and the money that they have siphoned to the Democratic Unionist Party for the Brexit campaign. Because this is an organisation that has no website, no published report, no published accounts. This is the very definition of shady, and it's not something that we should accept in our democracy.
John Trickett.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you very much for granting this debate this afternoon. We've heard a number of very important contributions, haven't we? It's difficult to disagree with any of them, because nobody from the opposition on the government bench has actually bothered to speak, although they attempted to prick the arguments from time to time. Look, however you voted on the referendum, or whatever your views are now, the recent revelations in connection with the Brexit campaign raise very serious questions about the function of our democracy, go right to the heart of who we are as a country. And in truth, let me start by saying this: we could not even be holding this debate if it were not for the hard work, the courage, the diligence and the honesty of journalists working for our media. It's a profession which politicians rarely thank, journalists, but also whistleblowers. However uncomfortable it may be for the powerful in our society, and for any of us, it's clearly essential for the function of a democracy that we protect the respective roles both of journalists and of whistleblowers. It demeans our politics, therefore, to attempt to destroy a whistleblower's case, not by addressing the matters which were being raised, but by insinuating a malicious personal motive on the part of the whistleblower. And it's especially sinister. Indeed, it was shameful when those insinuations emerged from Downing Street, as we've heard, and when their source was then defended by the Prime Minister personally. After all, the government has a policy on whistleblowing. It's quite clear. It's on the government website this afternoon. It says, as a whistleblower, you are protected by the law. You should not be treated unfairly or lose your job because you blow the whistle. But Mr. Sani has been untreated unfairly in a way which is absolutely disgraceful. And democracy depends on more than just journalists and whistleblowers. It needs transparency. It needs a rules-based level playing field. If these attributes of transparency and a level playing field are missing, then our democracy will be in severe danger, and I believe it may well be. The stakes have never been higher because the referendum itself which is a major constitutional turning point in this country's history. And the House will not forget that the Leave campaign was headed by two distinguished members of this House, who arguably now owe their membership of the British Cabinet to the role they played in the Brexit campaign. They say, don't they, Mr. Speaker, to the victor belong the spoils. But it's too soon yet to draw any firm conclusions that the vote Leave itself broke the rules, but there are clearly reasons to worry. And before reciting some of the known facts, let's remind the House that the law on referenda, which we passed, doesn't prevent donations from one campaign body to another, but it does forbid collusion between them, because otherwise it would not be a level playing field between the two sides on the referendum. If one campaign exceeds a spending cap by deliberately and perhaps surreptitiously spawning satellite or puppet operations, then that crucial principle of equity between the two parties is then lost. So I just want to list quickly what we do now know, some of which has been mentioned but others haven't. Let me just quickly go through it. Vote Leave raised more money than the statutory spending cap, 1. 2, they donated surplus funds to other campaigning bodies, amongst which were the youth body called Believe. 3, these two campaigns shared the same building. 4, there was a revolving door between the staff of the two organisations. They then both used the same small Canada-based company, AIQ, whose purpose seems to have been to harvest data from social media in order to target Leave messaging to British voters. By a strange coincidence, Leave.eu, the campaign led by Messrs Farage and Banks, amongst others, also used the very same Canadian firm. And by the way, there are at least 2 other bodies, which have been mentioned briefly today, which received donations from Vote Leave. One was Veterans for Britain, and the other, though they're not in their place, was the DUP. The DUP also received money. What's remarkable, a remarkable coincidence, is that both the Veterans for Britain and the DUP reportedly used the same firm, AIQ, the small firm based in Canada, I'm told, above a shop. I will very briefly, but we want to try to finish in reasonable.
For Britain, is he aware that they are consistent giving evidence to the Defence Select Committee and above some of the comments I made earlier during the debate, there is now grave concern about the links to national security in this very debate?
I think the honourable member makes the point which speaks for itself. Well, look, so far so good. Those are the facts as I understand them. But until last week, there was evidence that the various Leave campaigns were rubbing shoulders with each other, often in the same office, but not that there was specific collusion. But this is where the recent revelations which have brought this debate to take place today from the whistleblower change the nature of our understanding of what had happened. Because Mr Sani was right at the core of the Believe organisation from its very inception. Indeed, I understand he was the treasurer, although he says he never actually saw the money pass through the accounts. He had previously worked in the Vote Leave organisation, and he says he was directed by them to join Believe. He further goes on to say that Believe was established by Vote Leave, that the money which it donated was in effect under the control not of Believe but of senior members of Vote Leave staff. And he goes on to argue that the money which was donated by Vote Leave allegedly to Believe actually was directed by Vote Leave to be spent on AIQ. If these allegations of collusion are true, then they amount to a serious breach of the regulations and to a de facto fusion of the two campaign groups. And therefore, one has to assume under those circumstances there was an illegal spend by Vote Leave / Believe of about 10% of the total statutory cap. That was illegal. And yet a further allegation has been made, because it said that after the referendum, Vote Leave staff then destroyed or doctored the electronic data files which they held in order to remove any reference to an interconnection between the two campaigns. It's hard to conclude other than that this was a puppet campaign designed to avoid electoral law. If there was nothing to hide, why would they destroy or change the files? Mr. Speaker, given the historic scale of the referendum, what it presaged for our country, we must have a proper and urgent investigation. But the truth is that this House is not the proper place to carry out such an investigation. And let's be blunt about the reason why. It's because the government is in it up to its neck. Two cabinet ministers fronted the organisation. There they sit week after week. The Bonnie and Clyde of Brexit. And I'll leave it to the House to decide who is Bonnie and who is Clyde out of the two of them. But the way in which they then had a pantomime swag bag allegedly full of £350 million a week for the NHS turned out to be completely, as we know, untrue. Meanwhile, the sheriff herself, in the shape of the Prime Minister, had publicly defended her own political secretary after his personalised attack on the whistleblower. They cannot represent themselves as honest brokers. So who will step up to carry out the investigation of these new revelations? Clearly, it must be the Electoral Commission and, if necessary, the police. At present, the Commission are under-resourced and lack necessary powers to carry out the task. After all, the situation of last week with the Information Commissioner revealed how limited the powers and resources are to that organisation in trying to get access to Cambridge Analytica files. We, on this side, now demand that the government recuse itself from looking into these matters and commission a wholly independent investigation instead. The EC should be given the extra powers and resources it needs to follow the evidence wherever it takes them. They should then report to this House and to the public directly so that there is no suspicion of interference by interested parties in powerful places. Mr. Speaker, I'll finish with this point. Sunlight, as we've been told many times, is the best disinfectant. We've seen the Prime Minister, beholden to the extreme wing of her party, who are running wild and unchecked. If she wants to stand up for our democracy and to show she has nothing to hide, she will surely now work with any investigation as a matter of urgency.
Just before I call the Minister to reply on behalf of the Government, I just gently make the point that in conformity with convention, and she's a most courteous Minister, she'll seek to allow a minute or two for the Right Honourable Gentleman, Member for Carshalton and Wallington, to conclude. Thank you. I call the Minister. Chloe Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and of course I shall, with pleasure, leave time for the Right Honourable Member to conclude the debate. Mr. Speaker, there are two things I think I ought to begin this debate by saying. The first is this. As a Minister, I shall respect the integrity of independent investigations and so will not comment here today on allegations that rightly belong with the ICO or the Electoral Commission for investigation. I do hope that honourable and right honourable members will join me in respecting that rather important legal principle, and I set it out here at the beginning of my remarks to help the House with that clarity. Secondly, as the Minister responsible for the electoral system, I am actually, Mr. Speaker, proud to say that the UK has a clear and robust electoral system. We should all be proud of the democracy in which we live and work. I would actually like to place on record my thanks to all involved in the electoral community who work so hard at every poll to deliver it within the law, such that we can be proud of our democracy. Now, turning to the EU referendum, the Electoral Commission concluded that it was a well-run poll and that it was delivered without any major issues. Now, we also know that it was one of the largest democratic exercises in our history. I recognise, indeed we've seen it here today, that that referendum and its subject matter elicits high emotion. It elicits high emotion on both sides and clearly continues to do so. But with 17.4 million votes to leave the European Union, more people voted for Brexit than have ever voted for anything else in the UK. We, therefore, have to respect the will of the people from that referendum, and we are delivering it. So this government, Mr. Speaker, is committed to ensuring the best possible outcome for the British people in the negotiations to leave the EU.
I thank the Minister for giving way, and she's just repeated a line which the Prime Minister used to dismiss my inquiries regarding this matter yesterday. But given that
some of her Downing Street staff are the subject of these allegations and use disgraceful House of Cards style tactics to divert attention by outing a whistleblower as being gay. And given that there are senior cabinet ministers that led the Vote Leave campaign, doesn't the Prime Minister have, and her government, have a number of questions to answer outside of the Electoral Commission investigation, a number of questions to answer regarding these events?
Mr Speaker, I won't be adding anything in this debate to what the Prime Minister had to say yesterday on those issues, but I will turn to the matters at hand under this application today. And I'd like to thank the House for its comments in the course of today's debate. Now, there have been various allegations, of course, that have come out into the media over the past week. I think it is important to be clear about what those involve, which are directly linked to the UK's electoral law and which may not be. Now, first of all, there were a series of allegations about Cambridge Analytica using Facebook data to profile American voters. Now, that matter is primarily a data protection issue. It is a serious allegation, and the Information Commissioner is undertaking a formal investigation using its powers. The government is strengthening the remit of the Information Commissioner through the Data Protection Bill by giving it tougher powers to ensure organisations comply with its investigations, including the ability to impose significant fines. We will consider the Information Commissioner's proposal for further powers as the bill passes through Parliament. Secondly, there have also been allegations about whether some of the spending ahead of the EU referendum was properly declared. Now, some of those matters have already been subject to Electoral Commission investigations. Others may well be so in due course. And I return to the point I made at the beginning, Mr Speaker, that I shall not comment on investigations that are being carried out. In this country, the Electoral Commission is the independent body which oversees the conduct of elections and referendums and regulates political finance. It is that commission which reports regularly on the running of elections and referendums, conducts thorough investigations into allegations that rules have been breached. Does he have a better one than he had last time?
Given that the points that I made were about the conduct of Downing Street staff and her ministers, this is not about the Electoral Commission, this is about the Prime Minister's integrity and the judgment about appointing those staff.
Mr Speaker, I regret to say that he seems to be under a misunderstanding about the debate that you have granted in the place this afternoon, which is, after all, about electoral law. So, as the Minister responsible for electoral law, I shall answer on that point. What I will go on to say is this. The Commission, the Electoral Commission, is independent of government. It is, indeed, accountable to Parliament via, Mr Speaker, your committee on the Electoral Commission, the Speaker's Committee on the Electoral Commission. Now, one important thing that has come up in the debate today, which I think is really worth picking up at this point of my remarks, some have suggested today that the Electoral Commission is under-resourced. I would encourage honourable members to take a look at the Electoral Commission's operating costs of this year, which show an underspend against its anticipated budget. Indeed, in January of this year, they returned funds. Now, I leave it to others to then draw conclusions from that about whether the Commission is resourced correctly or not. But I would say again, the Electoral Commission is accountable to Parliament, and those are questions that Parliament and, Mr Speaker, your committee could rightly look into. To safeguard elections, it is... I will make progress because we do have to finish this debate on time, of course. It is time limited. To safeguard elections, it is vital to have an independent regulator. The Electoral Commission needs to be able to act independently without government interference. I'm a little disappointed by the Honourable Member for Hemsworth's rather loose thinking, I think, where he says that the government, I think his argument is, first of all, that the government ought to have been able to investigate these things, but then he thinks that's not correct. And then he says, oh, well, as a fallback, the Electoral Commission will do it instead. Let me be absolutely clear. It is a good thing that in this country we have that independent regulator. We cannot have it both ways. The independent regulator should do its independent job. I have heard too many arguments put in the chamber this afternoon that suggest that, in fact, what we ought to be doing in this House somehow is preempting the Electoral Commission's work. We should not do so. And as I said at the outset of my remarks, I will not do so. Allegations have been made about campaigners at the EU referendum. The specific allegations about spending rules and the accuracy of campaigners' spending falls squarely within the remit of the Electoral Commission. It has announced investigations into various campaigners at that referendum. It has already investigated a number of complaints and found no wrongdoing in those. It will publish its findings in due course. Now, as the Right Honourable Member who requested this debate, and I thank him for having brought it to this place, as he acknowledged yesterday, there may be sub judice issues here, and he quite rightly used that point in his application for this debate. It will not, and again I repeat myself here, it would not be appropriate for me or the government to comment on any ongoing investigations from that point. Now let me turn instead to what might happen after that, because a number of points have been raised this afternoon about what might be the next steps from there.
Could she address the concerns raised by me, but also by the whistleblower Christopher Wiley, who spent a great deal of time with the Information Commission this week, that they don't have the resources or the expertise they need to do these investigations properly?
I think the honourable gentleman is asking me about, as to whether the Information Commissioner has the resources. Is that what he's asking? Yes, and the expertise. Okay, I understand the point. Now, he will appreciate, first of all, and I know he's a very senior and experienced member of this House, he will appreciate that I'm here to answer about electoral law, such was the title of the debate. But it is important, of course, that these issues do come together. He will have seen my honourable friend, the Minister for the Data Protection Bill, joining with me to listen to part of this debate. And I think he will know from his expertise that the government is seeking to give the Information Commissioner stronger powers, for example, around warrantry, around compulsion, potentially looking at sanctions, and that the government is considering doing even more after the Cambridge Analytica allegations that have been brought out. And I believe that will have been made clear to members of the Data Protection Bill Committee, on which I don't sit, but which members of the House will have done. Now, as to whether the Information Commissioner has the expertise within that, I would certainly hope that they do, but I shall ask my honourable friend to contact him to ensure that he has that answer to his satisfaction. Let me conclude, Mr. Speaker, because time is coming to that point. Now, allegations that the rules may have been breached, the electoral law rules may have been breached, would rightly be a cause for concern, are rightly a cause for concern. But this does not necessarily follow that the rules themselves were flawed, and I do not think it is right to reach any conclusions on such an issue until the investigations of the Electoral Commission are complete. It wouldn't be right to jump to conclusions or start to amend the system, attempt to amend the system, before any allegations have been proven. In conclusion, Mr. Speaker, the government will continue to work closely with the Electoral Commission, along with many other stakeholders in the electoral system, to protect the integrity and security and effectiveness of referendums and elections. Secondly, Mr. Speaker, we will, let me make this very clear for the record today, we will continue to implement this referendum's result and to make a success of it.
Tom Brake. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I start by thanking you indeed again for facilitating this debate. The Minister in her response said that she would not be drawn on the allegations that have been referred to the Electoral Commission and the police, although she did then go on to say that we have a clear and robust electoral system. And I would perhaps gently chide the Minister, she might want to wait for the outcome of these investigations to see whether in fact we do have the clear and robust electoral system that she suggests that we have. She also would not comment on the actions of the Prime Minister's political officer. Now that, as a number of members have said, is not a matter that is sub judice. I think it is a matter of morals and the actions that were taken which have exposed someone to risk. And I think that we might actually read into the fact that the Minister didn't want to respond to that. In perhaps her view might be that in fact that's something that the Prime Minister should look at very carefully and consider very carefully the position of that member of staff. Now, we've had very many challenging contributions from the opposition benches, silence from the other side, apart from the Minister, apart from a few interventions. I asked the Minister a few specific questions at the end, which she did not answer, so I hope she will be able to do that in writing, specifically about whether there is the need for any legal reforms. And I must say, to conclude, Mr. Speaker, that I don't think anyone on the opposition benches today will be leaving reassured that the law wasn't broken and that the people weren't cheated, but we'll have to wait for the outcome of the inquiry to see whether these allegations are true or false.
Oh, very well. I'm going to put the question first, and then we'll come to the right honourable gentleman's point of order. The question is that this House has considered the EU referendum and alleged breaches of electoral law. As many as have their opinion say aye. Aye. For the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order. I'll come to the honourable lady first, because she had indicated to me an intention to raise a point of order, and then I'll come to the right honourable gentleman. I'm saving him up. It's a delectation of the House. Point of order, Lucy Powell.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I wonder whether you, Mr. Speaker, have had any advance notice from the government around their intention to give a statement in response to the very important Kerslake review into the response in the aftermath of the Manchester Arena attack, because it has raised, while it was positive in many ways, it has raised some serious questions for some national protocols and the national helpline run by the government. I wonder whether government have given you that notice.
Well, I'm grateful to the honourable lady. The short answer is no. It is an extremely important and sensitive matter which the honourable lady highlights, and I appreciate that she does so not least in her capacity as a constituency member of Parliament. It will be a matter of considerable concern, not just to members in affected constituencies, but right across the House. I've received no such notification, but knowing the perspicacity and ingenuity of the honourable lady, I feel sure that she'll find ways of highlighting the matter in the chamber sooner rather than later.
Point of order.
Point of order, Sir Edward Davey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister, in her closing speech, mentioned the role of the Speaker's Committee on the Electoral Commission in these types of discussions and inquiries. My understanding of your committee, sir, is that your statutory duties are focused on things like the estimates and the resources that apply to the Electoral Commission. That has been raised as a matter of debate, so I wonder, sir, if you may want to enlighten the House on what role you might take and your committee might take in this regard.
The short answer to the right honourable gentleman is that he's right. The Speaker's Committee on the Electoral Commission preoccupies itself with the estimate, scrutiny thereof. That is a narrow, albeit important, remit. We are concerned with resources, and there have been occasions when a particular issue appertaining to the Electoral Commission has arisen that has caused the committee to meet, to hear from its officers. However, so far as investigations are concerned, and to be fair, the Minister didn't suggest otherwise, those are not matters in which my committee would in any way become involved. There is a model for this in relation to IPSA as well, the model of a committee scrutinising an estimate, and members should have that in the forefront of their minds. We do not get involved in investigations, and insofar as the right honourable gentleman's point of order and my response has made that even clearer, I welcome that. Point of order. Point of order, Geraint Davis.
This debate is question whether the Brexit vote may have actually occurred illegally, or illegal activity may have affected the outcome, and therefore questions the legitimacy of the vote itself and subsequent activity in this chamber. In your view, Mr. Speaker, what should be the next steps in the event that it is found categorically that illegal activity may reasonably be found to distort the outcome of that democratic referendum?
Well, I'm bound to say to the honourable gentleman, who's quite an experienced member of the House, I think that's a triumph of optimism over reality. For the honourable gentleman to seek to beguile me into participating in an exchange on that matter is not, I think, reasonable, and the puckish grin on his face suggests that he's keenly aware of that fact. The question that the honourable gentleman puts to me is a hypothetical one, and what I would say to the honourable gentleman is that I've always thought that the late Lord Whitelaw spoke very good sense when he said, on the whole, I prefer to cross bridges only when I come to them. We'll leave it there for now. If there are no further points of order, perhaps we can proceed.